I'm starting to hate my life, not because I'm a terrible person. I'm not suicidal, and I don't hate life itself. I'm starting to hate my life because I have ideas that are in my head, burning and fighting like little Olympic gods, cramped inside my skull, and they just won't stop. They wrestle every night, and I can feel them punching each other. It's not the best feeling, but without them, I don't feel very much at all. Oh, that's schizophrenia. I've heard that before, but no, it's not. This is different, I'm sure of it. These small little deities aren't personalities, and if they were, they wouldn't be my personalities. They have voices, of course, who doesn't? But they aren't my voices. These demigods are just ideas, though they fight each other in a way that would make Charles Darwin proud that he named his theory survival of the fittest. It's a beautiful battle, but bloody and horrific. It's one that has no escape and rarely a resolution. On the outside, my eyelids twitch because I only got about 3 hours of sleep last night. But inside my skull, twitching eyelids are the least of my worries. They're just the physical manifestation of an all-out, good and hearty, down-and-out fist fight. And every so often, they miss each other and hit the back of my eyes, causing my eyelids to twitch. You should see a doctor. I've heard that before too. I thought that would solve this little headache issue of mine, so I gave it a try. But I didn't get a solution, just drugs and pills. And ideas don't like drugs and pills. They like pen and paper. No, I didn't need a doctor. I needed a new notebook, or better yet, a giant whiteboard where my ideas could splay themselves out across the wall and move the battle onward. Onward and upward, more violent and more creative. The battle raged in ways and shapes I never expected. The ideas started to learn karate and taekwondo and archery and fencing, and finally I just had to stop and ask, where do you guys learn all of this stuff anyway? I don't know any of this. But of course they didn't answer. They just kept on fighting until it wasn't just twitchy eyelids, but muscle spasms and jittery fingers and achy backs and stiff knees. Finally, I met a man who shared the same problem, enduring the endless fighting across a war-torn no man's land inside his brain. I happened to take a seat next to him on the trolley. He took one look at me and said, "It's the ideas, isn't it?" "Yes, of course, you have them too," I said, sounding like an excited schoolboy going through puberty. "How do you survive them?" He looked at me and smiled. "Oh, I put them all down. They're under control. The only thing they do now is knock on my door when they're hungry, and I bring them a nice little brown paper bag of groceries, and that keeps them quiet for a while." "Oh," I said, startled quite a bit, and before I had a chance to ask whether or not it was worth it, the trolley stopped and the man got off. Just then, I heard a knocking on the door to my brain, followed by the terrible bang of a grenade going off inside my head. A nice little brown paper bag of groceries, I thought. You traded your raging ideas for a nice little brown paper bag full of groceries? You traded your sleepless nights, your wild rabbit hole conversations, your crazed poetry-filled stampedes, your ballistic word cannons and semi-automatic illustration sprees and violent brainstorming escapades and spontaneous, directionless wandering for peace of mind and a bag of groceries. I shrugged and stayed on that goddamn trolley, wherever it was going to take me, my eyelids twitching at every stop. This was one of 365 short stories that I wrote in a project I did called A Story Each Day. And when I was doing this project, I started to realize that sometimes I felt more comfortable speaking the language of stories than I did speaking any other language. And it raises this question: what is your language? When we commonly think about language, we think of English or Spanish or Mandarin or French. We think of a collection of words that are used by a particular country or a particular group of people, but very rarely do we think about language in this broader idea as a medium for making change in the world around us, or as a vehicle for expressing meaning into the world. Very rarely do we think of photography as a language, or music as a language, or art or painting, or business or filmmaking, or dance or cooking or code. These are the languages that I want you to think about. For me, this pursuit of the language of storytelling started right out of school. I was determined that I was going to tell stories, and I was going to tell stories through filmmaking. So when I graduated from the College of Design, I was determined, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a filmmaker. And I had made a couple of films in school that were successful on my scale. And so, like any aspiring filmmaker, I decided I was either going to move to New York or LA, because that's what aspiring filmmakers do. And in preparation for this, I started sending out my resume to hundreds of different video production companies in New York. And I did this in the evening, though. During the day, I took this ridiculous job doing door-to-door political surveys, usually in some random suburb in Cary. I now have a small hatred for random suburbs in Cary. No offense to anyone who lives in a random suburb in Cary. I spent a lot of time there. And I remember the first call back that I got from one of these resumes that I sent out. And it was this video production company in Manhattan. And I actually was in a random suburb in Cary when I got this call. And they said, we're a video production company. We like your resume. We want you to start in August. And pays $40 a day. And I was like, yes. And I think that this is the first thing I want you to take away from this morning, is that sometimes when you're pursuing a creative passion, you have to be able to jump into something that you just have no idea what it is going on. When I moved to New York, I didn't really know what I was doing. I'd been there once. It happened to be the same weekend as Hurricane Sandy, which is a whole other story. But so I'd been there once. I had a handful of friends. I moved into this closet of an apartment with 4 other people that I'd never met before. I just showed up and I was like, hey, good to meet you. I moved up there working at this company that I didn't know anything about, and had an internship that paid $40 a day. So I packed my life into this suitcase, and I got on to an overnight bus, and I got dropped off in Chinatown, where no one spoke my language. And I think that this is something that we all come across in creative projects. We all have these moments where, in order to move things forward, you have to put yourself in an uncomfortable situation. You have to get dropped off in Chinatown, where no one speaks your language, because it forces you to stretch yourself, and it forces you outside of your comfort zone, but it forces you to start learning other languages. And that's what happened for me. So when I moved to New York, I immediately got involved in a group somewhat similar to CreativeMornings, a little bit different. It was a little bit smaller, and every week a new artist would present their process. They would talk about their work. And there was one artist in particular. She was a violinist. She said something that really made this pursuit of storytelling as a language much more clear for me. It was almost like the Rosetta Stone. Like, I understood things better because of the way that she understood her process. And she said, I've practiced every single day for 25 years. And when I forget to practice, it feels like I've skipped a meal. Like, it feels like something is wrong when I forget to practice. When I don't play violin, it feels like something is wrong. And this really shifted my view and understanding of how there are all of these different languages, and storytelling is a language, and violin is a language. It made me understand that in order to learn a language, you really have to make it part of who you are. You can't just practice. Like, if I was trying to learn Spanish, I couldn't just practice once a month and expect to become fluent at this language. I couldn't just practice every couple of weeks. If I want to become a storyteller, and if I want to become fluent in this language of stories, I have to practice it as often as I can. I have to practice it every single day. And I have to make it not just part of what I do, but part of who I am. And so I realized that if you want to speak a language fluently, you have to make it part of who you are. So I thought about this, and I thought about how could I make filmmaking or storytelling part of who I am. So this was in the fall, and I was looking forward into the next year, and I thought I could write one short story every single day. I'm going to start in January 1st, I'm going to write a short story, and I'm going to go all the way to December 31st, and I'm going to write one short story every single day for an entire year, 365 stories. How hard could this be? And this is the second thing that I really want you to take away, is that if I had known how difficult it was going to be to do this project, I never would have started. And this is something that we all come across in our creative projects. We all get to a point where that element of faith and believing that you can do something even though you have no idea how, that's so crucial and that's so important. There's some really amazing examples of this idea of faith, not just in creative projects, but one of my favorites is actually in a scientific project. This is the Large Hadron Collider in Europe. And when they started the designs for this project, the engineering for this project in the early 90s, it included technology that didn't even exist yet. They started the designs without even knowing how this technology was going to work. I can just imagine looking at the blueprints, and they're talking about how many millions and millions of dollars are going into this project and how many thousands of people are working on it, and just saying, okay, here are the blueprints, and then here's this part where, yeah, that technology doesn't exist. We've got to figure that out. And it's amazing to me that something like this project, like something that's so grounded in something like this, like science, and so grounded in research, and so grounded in all the millions of dollars that are going into it, can come down to faith. And it's really amazing. To give you an idea of the process that I went through, when I first started this project, I was really excited to get into it, and I just started writing. I just went straight into it without really understanding the whole scope of it, and I think that was a really important part of it. But to give you an idea of the moments of faith that I really had to have in going into this project, I would get off my $40 a day internship, and I would scramble into the subway, and I would take the subway 45 minutes or an hour back to my closet of an apartment in Brooklyn, and I would run up the stairs and get in this small, tiny apartment with 4 other people, all living their lives, and I would sit down at my computer, and I would open a Word document, and I would stare at this blank page. And oftentimes, I would have no idea what to write. And I want to show you a rough draft from earlier on in the project. This is this is what I would do, and this is the kind of faith that I would have on a daily basis, where I would literally just sit down in front of this blank page, and I would write the word "write" until I couldn't write that word anymore, and I would write a different word, and then I would keep writing different words until I had just a sentence, and I would try and use that sentence as a springboard into a story, which is what you see here, just writing the word "right" over and over and misspelling it and all sorts of fun stuff. But as artists and as creative people, we face that blank page all the time. We face that blank page. We face the blank canvas. Or if you're a musician, you can hold your instrument and you can sit in a room full of silence, and you face this fear of not knowing what is going to come out of your mind. And I face this on a daily basis, and it was very, very difficult. But this just gives you an idea of sort of the struggle that I went through. And it was actually pretty interesting. A couple of weeks ago, I was digging through my computer, and I found this folder of rough drafts that I had sort of forgotten was there. And I didn't even realize how many I had written, but I had like 250 of these rough draft documents. Most of them were just sort of ridiculous pieces of something like this. But it was really interesting to look back and see just the amount of faith that goes into a project like this. So about halfway through the project, I got a call from a good friend of mine back here in Raleigh. And he said, "I know you're working this $40 a day internship, but I want you to move back to Raleigh, and I want you to help me start this company." And this was a really big decision for me because facing Raleigh again was sort of a little bit of a conflict for me. Like when I had left Raleigh, I was so excited to try something new. I was so excited to get dropped off in Chinatown and just leave Raleigh behind me. And it was almost like I had buried it. I was done. I was like, okay, Raleigh, you've served me well. This is great, but I'm ready to move on. And so when I moved back to Raleigh, I was faced with this feeling like I was facing an old challenge in a new way. And I was very delighted after living in Raleigh for about a year and a half, almost 2 years now. I can say that a lot of the things that I was looking for moving to New York, I've actually found here in Raleigh. But when I first moved, it was difficult. And it was a lot of this just sort of feeling of transition and this feeling of change and not knowing what was going on. And this is, once again, the element of faith. Like, I didn't know what was going to happen. I've never worked at a startup before. I've never started a company. I've never been involved in that level of that kind of project. And all the while I was doing that, I was working on a story each day. So I was writing a story every single day and facing that blank page. And I want to share another story with you. This one is one of my favorite stories because anytime you're faced with these big decisions of starting a project like this and moving to a new city or facing an old challenge again, and just that element of uncertainty, it finds its way into your creative work. And that was definitely the case for this story. I remember where I was when I wrote this, or when I came up with the idea and got the inspiration for this story. I had just moved back to Raleigh, and I was going for a run in downtown. And I just remembered looking around and seeing all of the buildings that were going up and all of the old buildings that were getting renovated or demolished and just the new buildings that were popping up everywhere and the streets that were getting rearranged and the streets that were getting repaved. And when I got back to my apartment, I realized Raleigh is changing and growing so fast, but so am I. So I wrote this story on July 30th, and this one is called Lines of Paint in My Mind. The streets of Raleigh are marked and lined with construction spray paint, the kind that workers use to denote where electrical wires are buried, where to dig and where not to dig, where it's okay to drill and where it's not okay to drill, where the water lines run and where there's nothing but plain old dirt. Raleigh is growing and expanding by the minute, and by the time one building is finished, they start tearing up the lot right next to it and start something new. But for every line of construction spray paint that's put down, it's inevitable that they'd miss one, isn't it? Of course it is. Somehow, the line that was supposed to denote where the main water pipe is on our street never got marked. I woke up one morning, turned on the faucet to brush my teeth, and no water came out. I stepped outside to see a flood of water pouring down our street, turning the road into a shallow river. I looked upstream to see a crew of construction workers staring down into a hole in the ground. One held a jackhammer, one held a shovel, and one held a sandwich. I wandered up to them, still clothed in only gym shorts and an old faded X-Men t-shirt. "Any idea when the water's coming back on?" I asked, trying to sound respectful. "Your guess is as good as mine," the one with the sandwich muttered between bites. "We're trying to get this thing fixed as fast as we can, but it could take all day." "What happened?" "Idiot didn't mark it. Marked all the other spots, but missed this one, so we thought it was clear. Idiot." I frowned, looking at the steady spring of water shooting out of the ground. I turned around and went back inside, trying to pretend like I hadn't missed several vital parts of my morning routine. Well, I should have been in the shower or brushing my teeth, or at least on my second cup of coffee. I imagined all of the places where there are missing construction markers that should be painted onto the ground. The street in front of my house isn't the only place that doesn't have markings telling workers where they should be going and where they shouldn't be going. I'm pretty sure that if there is a God, he forgot a couple of spray-painted lines in my life. No doubt, someone as productive as God would be building and growing things all the time, wouldn't he? He has the entire world to look after, and millions of people asking for things every single day. It only makes sense that he'd have someone else mark the pavement in the minds of the people he's working on. And with all of those people, it only makes sense that somewhere there'd be a line that somebody missed. So when God finally gets to me, he starts building full force, knocking down old ruins and drilling down into the dirt of my mind to secure the foundations of whatever the hell he's building. The street in front of my house isn't the only place that's missing some guiding lines of paint. And so for all of God's good intentions, he hits the main water line and turns the street in my mind into a river. My thoughts wash through the street, flooding the sidewalks and rushing over those old memories that won't budge. Secrets I'd buried years ago become unearthed, and those hidden grudges I thought were safe and secure wash to the surface. That time I lied to my dad bubbles right to the top, along with that relationship with that girl I haven't talked to in years, but have thought about every day since. My mother drifts past, followed by all of the times I ignored her when all she wanted to do was get to know her son. They wash by, and I'm left standing in a soggy front yard, surrounded by fragments of trash and litter that I thought were long gone by now. I stare at the river rushing through the front lawn of my mind, just wishing I could brush my freaking teeth. I begin to wonder whether or not this was part of God's plan all along, or whether somebody just forgot to tell him where the water line was. So I wrote this story right when I moved back to Raleigh. And this was about 8 months through the project. And about 9 or 10 months through the project, September, October, and into November, that was when things started to get really difficult and the project started to get really interesting. And this is something that I think that all of us as creative people, when we're working on a project like this, we run into. We run out of these pathways and these channels that come easily to us. Anytime we're learning a language, whether it's Spanish or Mandarin, sometimes they're the easy words to learn because there are some words that might be similar to the language that you already know. And at a certain point, you exhaust those words. You start running out of the words and the techniques and the little tips and the tactics and the tricks that are easy and the ideas that come naturally. And then you really start to stretch yourself. And that's what was going on at this point in the project. It got to a point where I would get done with work at this startup, and sometimes that was pretty late. Sometimes I wouldn't actually get to stare at this blank page until midnight. And I would sit down and I would face this blank page, and at this point in the project, I would just have no idea what to write. And I would do a lot of these crazy rough drafts where I would just have no idea. And so on top of that fear of not knowing if I would be able to finish, I started facing this fear of, even if I do finish all of these stories, are people going to want to read these stories? Is this something that people are going to be excited to hear about? And it got to a point in this project where throughout the project, I'd been marking the Word documents of the stories that I felt like really connected with me or would really connect with someone else. And throughout the project, I had a pretty consistent, it was like 5 to 10 per month, that I felt I was excited about. That's the stories that I felt like I could really share with someone. And there was a time closer to the end of this project when I went for like longer than 30 days without marking a story that I felt really, really excited about. And so it was this moment of just wondering, like, and just this uncertainty of like, are my stories good enough? And it got to a point where there were some friends of mine who said, maybe you should just cap this at 9 months. Maybe this should just be a 9-month project. It'll be a nice little project. And I think that they were trying to look out for me and like not, like trying to be encouraging. But I think that, when they said that, I was like, I can't do that because every single story was dependent on all of the other stories to make the project a complete whole. And so I told myself, I'm going to have this one rule, and if I follow this rule, I know for a fact that I'll be able to finish the project. I'll at least be able to finish it. I don't even know if people will want to read these stories, but I'll at least be able to finish it. So I told myself, I can't go to sleep until I've written a story. And that's what I followed. So as I neared the end of this project, I was going through all of this, facing the blank page. And it wasn't just the struggle of facing the blank page once. It was the struggle of facing the blank page and not knowing whether or not I was going to finish a story that day. And then even when I finished that story that day, I would close the Word document and save it, and I would go to sleep knowing that I would have to face that same blank page again the next day. And I would have to have even more faith that next day than I did then. So it was this constant struggle and knowing like, okay, I'll finish it today and I'll finish it tomorrow. But even if I finish it tomorrow, I'm gonna have to face it again the next day and again the next day. And so it was just this compounding feeling that I was going through at this time. And as I neared the end of the project, I started to think about, okay, what form do I want these stories to take? How am I going to put them out into the world? How are people going to read these if they want to read them? And I knew for me, if I could put these stories into a collection and hold them in my hands, that would be enough. That would be a success for me. And so I started to do research into a Kickstarter. I started to think about all of the small details of running a Kickstarter campaign. What's the best time of the year to launch a Kickstarter campaign? What's the best time of the week? What's the best time of the day? What kind of rewards should you have? What kind of structure for your rewards? What's the best, the optimal margin per reward that you offer? What is the best video? What's the best launch strategy? How do other successful projects do this kind of thing? So I started to just dive into all of this research. And on top of the fear of not being able to finish the story, and on top of the fear of not knowing if people wanted to read these stories, there was also this difficulty because literary publishing projects are not the most popular projects on Kickstarter. And so I was trying to consider all of these things. And so with 30 days left in the project, 30 days left in the year, when I could actually start to see the light at the end of this tunnel of like, all right, 30 more stories. That's all I've got to write, 30 more stories. I launched the Kickstarter campaign. And this was when the project was the most difficult because on top of running a whole campaign, I was also writing a story each day. I was facing this blank page. And on top of that, I was also wondering, are people going to want to read these stories? And then this other fear started to creep in because when you're doing a Kickstarter campaign, the whole point of it, the strategy is you have to tell as many people as possible about what you're doing. And so on top of this, it wasn't just the question of do people want to read these stories, but it was a question of do I want to share these stories? Because when I started this project, I wasn't thinking all of my friends are going to read this, my family's going to read this, my parents are going to read this, my grandparents are going to read this. I wasn't thinking that. I dove into it with this element of faith of just like, I'm going to do this. I didn't think about at the end when I was going to share all of these stories. And so I was facing all these different fears in this different way. And all of these different things came to a point a couple weeks after I launched the campaign. This was like 10 days left in the year, 10 days left in the project, 10 more stories to write. And I started getting these emails one after another from random people I didn't know. Like some of them were just from all over the world. There were some people in Australia, some people in Germany, and I was like, where are these coming from? What is going on? And so I went on to Kickstarter, and a story each day was the project of the day. And a story each day was on the homepage of Kickstarter. And Kickstarter had sent this project out to thousands of people all across the world. And in like an hour, my inbox was full of these people just emailing me and supporting me and the Kickstarter backers. And it was just full of all of these people who were like, this person has backed your campaign, this person has backed your campaign. And at this moment, I was like overwhelmed with the amount of support that was coming in from people that I didn't even know, people all across the world. There were people in Australia, people in Singapore, people in India, people in Germany that were just emailing me and telling me like, congratulations, like what is today's story? Like, I can't wait to get these stories and hold them in my hands. And I want to end with this idea that in order to speak a language authentically, you have to have faith in what you're doing. And for me, it was really important, and I realized this at the end of the project, you have to go into your creative pursuit. You have to speak your language as though no one else is going to judge it, and no one else is going to see it. You have to create without thinking about like, oh, what is this person going to think? Or what is that person going to think? And in order to speak your language truly and to speak your language authentically, you have to forget that anyone else will ever see it. So I want to encourage all of you to speak your language in faith. Thank you.